It's funny. I went back and scrolled on the calendar app on my iPhone to see what else was going on during my freshman year of college that I may have forgotten about and sure enough, there's a couple more things I want to talk about before I wrap up 2011, which is still just the first quarter, the fall quarter, not including the summer that I did with the freshman summer program of my freshman year of college. There's two huge things that I'm forgetting, and you're going to see why I'm chuckling, is that the whole reason I was at college, was that I wanted to one day go to vet school. I wanted to be a veterinarian. I actually did a term paper, a really involved research paper on mastitis a little bit later on in my career. But I wasn't ripping myself a new one getting a degree in chemistry because, that was my goal. It's a dream and it's a goal that I had since I was 9 years old. Much later in the story, something happens that firmly changes my mind, but that doesn't happen until much later, and it took a lot for that to happen. Getting ahead of myself, but this goal that I had of attending veterinary school, of being the first person in my family to graduate from college, of one day living a life where I made a living working with animals, that goal sustained me going back to like middle school. So even though things changed, even though that's no longer the case, it's a part of my life. It's a huge part of my life. And yeah, without giving up too much of the story, I bring all that to say that a lot of my freshman year was spent volunteering at a spay-neuter clinic. And the spay-neuter clinic was actually on the other side of Los Angeles. So UCLA is in Westwood. It's going to sound so bougie, but for all intents and purposes, the west side of LA is much different from the rest of LA. So it's Westwood. Beverly Hills is not far. Bel Air is like right next to it, that part of LA. Spay-neuter clinic was in Van Nuys, Sherman Oaks, Panorama City. I had to take a fairly long bus ride from one side of LA to the other to be able to participate and to be able to volunteer. And at first it was very like, oh my God, they wouldn't even let us touch the animals. It was like fixing vaccine packs or like spay-neuter packs and like, running the laundry, that kind of thing. But once they saw how dedicated I was and how serious I was, they let me do damn near everything. And I became really good friends with the other technicians. The vet even offered to let me, which was practically unheard of. She offered to pretty much like let me do some of the stitching. And I for some reason, I didn't take her up on that. But she saw how dedicated I was. And so she like answered any question that I had. And a couple of the vet techs even told me with who I had, for lack of a better term, more spicy conversations that I wasn't going to have with the vet. They told me that she told them that out of all of the volunteers from UCLA, that I was the one that she thought was going to end up making it to vet school. So just for general purposes, veterinary school is much more competitive than medical school. And much of that is due to the fact that there are only 28 veterinary schools in the United States. There might be 30 at this point. And in American culture, we're so used to things like people spending all this money taking their dog or cat to the vet, which I'm not going to comment on, especially since, anyway, I'm not going to comment on that. But what I don't think people realize is that, guess what? Vets are a pivotal role in the food supply. And not even just for those of you who eat meat. I'm talking about, what about dairy vets? I knew a vet who had a literal business, a whole business where all he did was like castrate sheep, a sheep castrating business in New Zealand. And he didn't have anybody to take over his business. And that was a huge problem with dairy vets in the United States. They're very older. And there's actually good money to be made. And also lots of scholarship programs. So again, I'm slipping back into my old school of thought and my old hopes and dreams and thinking that this was going to be my life. Interesting fact is that because it was Spay Neuter Project Los Angeles, SNPLA, it wasn't always the same vet, but that vet, she actually did, and she was attractive. And again, I was still very much into women at the time, but I remember that she was also insanely smart. So she did her undergrad in 2 years and then went to vet school and then got an MBA. So while she was a vet and had the practices and practiced as a vet, she also knew how to do all her investments. And she was always traveling, like I said, drop dead gorgeous. And yeah. Another one of the vets, would you believe me if I told you that his son-in-law was Steve Jobs' pilot? So I don't remember when Steve Jobs passed away, but it was somewhere around this time. And actually, that's all I'll comment on that. Won't say anything else. But okay, so SNPLA was a huge part of my life, my first 2 years of college. I haven't said much about the work-study job that I had, which sustained me, again, from literally the first quarter at college, my entire time at UCLA, which was I was in charge of the Finch colonies for an autism lab, Alzheimer's lab, which I'm not going to get too much into research because that wasn't my role. I was in charge of taking care of the Finch colonies where they would focus on the gene involving speech was a large part of their research. And actually, my PI knew that I was in the sciences and actually signed off on me to be able to take one of her upper division classes, and she was in the Department of Neuroscience. So in retrospect, it was hell on earth going through this, and it was expensive as shit. Everybody at UCLA has a fucking ego, because if you weren't the jackass that got into UCLA, then you're the jackass that, this is your career, and this is you're at the top of your career, right? I did get some good experiences that I can talk about now years later, but the last thing I want to talk about is the Occupy movement, because that happened. I was immersed in that, and I don't want to talk about my activism to the point where it distracts from my story, because I do think the roots of my activism happened back in high school, right? Living in San Francisco, 6th generation San Francisco native. Come on, right? Of course I'm going to be an activist. Of course I'm going to be an organizer. That just comes with the territory. But the Occupy movement was at its peak my freshman year of college. And of course I got involved, and I consider myself to be insanely lucky, because there were a couple of times where I very narrowly missed getting brutalized by the police. I never spent a night in jail, knock on wood, to this day. And my biggest memory, before I talk about that, the Occupy movement was a movement shedding light on the fact that all of the wealth in the world is owned by a handful of white men. And that's not a really big exaggeration. It's gotten even worse now, however many years later that this is being shot. So anyway, we had a campment on the UCLA campus. UCLA has a huge history of activism, of which I am quite honored to say that I was a part of. And I made a speech at the campment, and it was something like 9-10 o'clock at night. I wasn't sober, I'll be honest. So I said a lot of things that I probably would not have said, but I'll say this, I stand by every word that I said, because I've seen videos of it, and even though I cringed, and even though I was a shit show, I spoke my motherfucking truth. I did. I don't know where that video is, I don't care. I hope it doesn't exist anymore, but somebody gave me the megaphone. God damn. Anyway, we decided to go back to the dorms because I lived very close to where we were, and so it was very easy for me to get back. And our thought process was, we need to save the beds on the encampment for the people who are not even at UCLA, right? Who it's not so easy for them to find a place to spend the night. Mere 3 hours after we left the encampment, they got raided by police, brutalized, they tore everything down. So that now brings us to the end of 2011. And I'll talk more about, the spring quarter and how all of what I've talked about relates, because I'm not mentioning anything by accident, I promise you, and how that all relates, because things really pick up in the spring quarter. You'll see in the next video.